Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the incredible, nearly 40-year hero's journey of Adoniram Judson. He was the very first Protestant missionary to Burma, and honestly, his story is a remarkable saga of intellect, immense suffering, and just this absolutely unbreakable commitment. We're actually kicking things off with these words directly from Judson himself. In spite of sorrow, loss, and pain, our course be onward still. This wasn't just some nice poetic sentiment to him. It was his literal survival strategy. To endure decades of disease, imprisonment, and crushing personal tragedy, he had to anchor himself to this singular, relentless, forward-moving purpose. And when you look at his early years, the sheer juxtaposition of his life is just, well, it's fascinating. Born in Massachusetts back in 1788, Judson was exceptionally bright. We're talking about a kid who entered Brown University at just 16 and graduated with honors. It was a life of Ivy League intellect and deep comfort, which is obviously completely at odds with the brutal conditions he'd eventually face in Asia. Actually, at this point in his life, he had entirely ditched his Christian faith and embraced full-on skepticism. Right, so he was a confirmed skeptic until a deeply traumatic, almost unbelievable coincidence at a roadside inn completely shattered his worldview. Picture this. He's traveling, and he spends the entire night listening to the agonizing sounds of another traveler dying in the next room. But the real shocker? The next morning, the innkeeper tells him who died. It was Judson's own close college friend. Literally the exact same friend who had convinced him to reject Christianity in the first place. That haunting realization sparked a massive spiritual crisis, ultimately leading him back to his faith and igniting this unshakable calling to missionary service. From there, his life pivoted with lightning speed. In 1810, driven by this burning desire to bring the gospel to people who had never heard it, he volunteers for overseas missions, becoming one of the first Americans to do so. Fast forward to 1812, he marries Anne Hasseltine, who totally shared his intense calling, and they set sail for Asia. Now, here's a wild detail. During that long, agonizing voyage across the ocean, he's intensely studying the New Testament. And it actually leads him to change his theology mid-voyage. He adopts believer's baptism and joins the Baptist tradition, which then led the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society to support his ministry. Finally, in 1813, they arrive permanently in Burma, a completely unknown and frankly formidable land. Now, Burma was an exceptionally difficult mission field. I mean, imagine spending years working tirelessly in a totally foreign culture, only to see pretty much zero visible results. Because the barriers were just toweringly high. The society was grounded in deeply rooted Buddhism, meaning the locals already had a rich, ancient spiritual tradition. On top of that, foreigners were viewed with intense suspicion by both the authorities and the public. And the kicker? The Burmese language was extraordinarily challenging for an English speaker to master, so for several long years, Judson had essentially nothing to show for his efforts. But instead of throwing in the towel and sailing home, Judson leaned into that brilliant academic mind of his. He devoted himself to mastering the culture, essentially becoming one of the greatest linguists in missionary history. Get this, without any modern tools, no internet, no translation apps, he produced a Burmese grammar book, an English-Burmese dictionary, and ultimately a complete translation of the Bible into Burmese. He firmly believed people needed to interact with the text in their own native language. And that highly respected translation, it still influences generations of Burmese Christians today. But just as his monumental translation work was taking shape and he's finally making some real inroads, the geopolitical landscape violently shifted. The First Anglo-Burmese War broke out. Because he was a Westerner, the Burmese authorities immediately suspected him, basically lumping him in with the enemy forces. He was suddenly and terrifyingly arrested, and in an instant, all the progress he'd built over the last decade was stripped away. What followed was an absolute nightmare. For nearly 2 years, he was locked away in a death prison by the authorities. He endured horrors that would have broken almost anyone else. We are talking heavy iron chains, physical torture, extreme hunger, and rampant disease in incredibly harsh conditions. And all the while, his wife Anne was on the outside. She bravely and tirelessly begged the authorities for his release, managing to keep him barely alive by smuggling him food. And she did all of this while caring for their newborn infant daughter under the most extremely difficult, dangerous circumstances imaginable. Judson ultimately survived that grueling imprisonment. But in a heartbreaking twist of fate, freedom brought his greatest tragedy. Shortly after his release, his fierce advocate and beloved wife, Anne, whose health had been completely ruined by the stress of trying to save him, died from illness. And if that wasn't devastating enough, she was followed quickly in death by their young infant daughter. Honestly, the profound sorrow of losing your entire family right after surviving years of torture, it's almost impossible for us to comprehend. Yet, despite this suffocating sorrow, he anchored himself to this core belief. He said, "A life once spent is irrevocable. It will remain to be contemplated through eternity." He didn't abandon his mission. He chose to stay in Burma. He slowly recovered his health and his spirit, eventually resuming his preaching and translation work. He later married Sarah Hall Boardman Judson, who became an incredible missionary partner in her own right. Together, they established churches, trained a whole new generation of local leaders, and watched the number of believers steadily increase. Those small, incredibly painful beginnings finally blossomed into a growing movement. Judson poured literally every ounce of his energy into his mission until his body simply gave out. At 61 years old, while traveling by ship specifically to seek medical treatment in 1850, Adoniram Judson passed away. On April 12th of that year, following maritime tradition, his body was committed to the deep, buried at sea in the Bay of Bengal. He died far from his original home in Massachusetts, having given his entire adult life to the people of Burma.
40 years. That is how long he dedicated his life to Myanmar. While he didn't live to see the ultimate sprawling impact of his ministry, the foundation he laid was permanent. The churches he planted grew into one of Asia's largest Baptist communities. Today, hundreds of thousands of Christians in Myanmar trace their direct spiritual heritage right back to the foundational tools and translations begun by Judson's unwavering dedication. Judson once said, "The future is as bright as the promises of God." It's a stunningly optimistic statement from a man who endured prison, torture, and the tragic deaths of his closest family. His story forces us to reflect on the true nature of resilience. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. If one person's unwavering dedication can ripple out to impact hundreds of thousands of lives centuries later, what kind of permanent legacy is possible for you today?